A mainland director from many years later unexpectedly returned to Hollywood in 1986, starting his legendary journey of gradually controlling the world's largest film and television industry center. This book has been signed and can be collected and read with confidence. During the new book period, it will be updated twice a day. Keywords of the novel: Hunting Hollywood without pop-ups, Hunting Hollywood TXT Complete Collection Download, Hunting Hollywood Latest Chapter Reading. Chapter 1. Westeros. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1 Westeros. After a brief sorting, the light gray canvas backpack contains several clothes, 2 manuscripts, a pen, and the rest were not intended to be taken away. He picked up his bag and carried it over his shoulder. He finally glanced at this small room without any lingering feelings in his heart. After all, this is a mental hospital. The head nurse at the door looked at the handsome boy who was slightly stunned in front of her, feeling both regret and joy. She whispered, "Simon, do you want to say goodbye to everyone?" His current name is Simon Westlow. The name has not changed. My surname was changed a month ago. Because I don't really like the original surname of this body, I am also looking forward to a brand new beginning. During the period before his rebirth, he happened to be watching Game of Thrones. The turbulent atmosphere on the continent of Westeros was captivating, and he had such a fantastic experience now. Therefore, he chose Westeros as his new surname on a whim. From now on, the novel version of Game of Thrones will not be released until 1996, 10 years later. As for how Martin should name his new continent in the future, it is not his concern. Upon hearing the head nurse's words, Simon regained his senses and shook his head, saying, "It's not necessary anymore." The two of them left the ward and arrived at Dr. Henry Chapman's office. Dr. Chapman was Simon's attending physician and a decent middle-aged man. There is also a middle-aged white man wearing glasses in the office, who introduces himself as John and is from Stanford University. The other person came to assist Simon in completing the discharge procedures. Simon was sent to this mental hospital 9 months ago. At that time, this incident also caused a small sensation. An inspirational teenager who grew up in a children's welfare home was admitted to Stanford University at the age of 17 and received a full scholarship. Then, less than 2 months after enrolling, I suddenly went crazy. Severe violent schizophrenia. This is the diagnostic result filled out by Dr. Chapman in Simon's medical record. The fact is, there are suddenly 12 more souls in the young body. How could they not go crazy? In the fragmented memory scene, young people with conflicting consciousness frantically destroyed an entire reading room in the Stanford University library, injured several people, and finally tied up and sent to this mental hospital in the southern suburbs of San Francisco. Continue to backtrack forward. Now he is actually a director from the other side of the ocean, just completed his first movie in life, and the box office is good. The company plans to negotiate a partnership with Universal Pictures, one of the 6 major Hollywood film companies. In order to win him over, the boss included him in the negotiation team heading to Los Angeles, which can be considered a government-funded trip. The prosperity of the mainland film market has made Hollywood flock to it, and business has naturally been very successful. After reaching the cooperation, the senior management of Universal Pictures invited the company team to attend a media industry gathering in Sun Valley, Idaho, along with many other Hollywood film practitioners. Over 20 people took off from Los Angeles in a Boeing 737. However, within less than half an hour of takeoff, the engine of the Boeing 737 malfunctioned and subsequently crashed during an emergency landing at San Francisco Airport. He regained consciousness, although still within the San Francisco County area. He had returned to 1985 and seemed to have been confined to a young body along with many other consciousnesses, followed by a long 9 months in a mental hospital. I don't know how I gained control of this body. Or, because he is the only foreigner in their consciousness. Before the crash, he happened to leave the luxurious front cabin where the global executives and company team were located, and went to the back cabin to discuss film production issues with a group of Hollywood colleagues. Or perhaps, because of unwillingness. During the long 9 months, he could feel the strong unwillingness of a teenager who had grown up so difficult. He didn't expect that life would just begin to set sail and fall into decline. He was equally unwilling, wasted so many years, and finally began to rise to fame. Everything turned into nothing in the blink of an eye. Anyway, he eventually became the owner of this body, and the other 10 or so consciousness fell into deep silence. However, although consciousness fades away, the memories of those people remain. Although those memories were scattered and shattered, he also realized that the remaining fragments of memory were a huge wealth for him. You should know that at that time, all the people in the back cabin of the plane were elites in the Hollywood film industry, including top screenwriters, photographers, editors, and music composers. These people were actually members of the production team of a box office blockbuster under Universal Pictures, and the director and lead actors of the production team were also on the plane. They were only invited to the front cabin, but it is unknown whether they survived or not. After completing the discharge procedures, Simon bid farewell to Dr. Chapman and others, and then boarded John's sedan with simple luggage. It can be seen that John didn't like today's job very much. He took Simon to the nearby bus station in Watsonville, fulfilled the last obligation of Stanford University, and hurriedly drove away. In the month leading up to discharge, Dr. Chapman had many conversations with Simon, asking him about his future plans. It is certainly possible to return to Stanford. Simon's major is still Stanford's most popular computer science. From more than 30 years later, he knows how many fascinating wealth miracles Stanford computer students have created in the upcoming internet wave. However, Simon did not hesitate much and chose to drop out of school. He is already a director, and his mind is filled with memories of more than 10 Hollywood elites. It can be said that he is now a top-notch film crew alone. With so many resources, there is no reason not to venture into Hollywood. As for the future internet wave, it is not Simon's character to look at the opportunities that can be seen everywhere and slip away at will. If one can stand out, one can naturally participate in the wealth feast brought about by this technological revolution as an investor or similar. Of course, at this moment, standing outside the bus stop near California Highway 1 in the small town of Watson, Simon understood that he was destined to have a long way to go. He is just a penniless poor boy now, and he is still somewhat grateful that his personal situation can enjoy free federal medical insurance. Otherwise, after 9 months of treatment, Simon would definitely have to bear an exorbitant medical bill that would make him doubt his life. In the United States, it is definitely a disaster for ordinary people to seek medical treatment without medical insurance. Buying a long-distance bus ticket to Los Angeles, Simon checked his wallet while waiting for the bus, and there was still $198 left, which he earned from summer work before enrolling last year. A while ago, I spent over $200 on the process of changing my name, mainly by publishing a name change notice in a small newspaper in Watsonville. This is a necessary procedure for Americans to change their names, and there is also a cost for reapplying for a driver's license. The driving license in the United States is equivalent to an ID card, and it is also very cheap to take, only a few tens of dollars. Therefore, although he couldn't afford a car, Simon obtained his driver's license at the age of 16. Based on the price information in my mind, the remaining money in my hand can last for about a week with basic food and accommodation guaranteed. This is already sufficient. It's easy to find a job in Los Angeles that is enough to make a living in just 1 week. The former owner of this body has been doing various odd jobs since the age of 13, and the related skill points are almost complete. Thinking of these, Simon even felt a faint sadness. Although the memory may not be complete, he could feel the awe-inspiring resilience of the original child. In my memory, Simon was sent to a children's welfare home in San Jose at the age of 6, but his little child was like a stubborn little beast, stubbornly refusing many adoption applications from foster families. At the age of 13, he began to rely on himself. With this thought in mind, Simon couldn't help but go back to his memories before the age of 6, but only some more fragmented scenes were pieced together, no matter what. Then, awakened from scattered thoughts, Simon was surprised to find tears sliding down his face unconsciously. A pair of mother and son waiting for the bus next to him were looking at him with strange eyes, and the young mother was pulling her 4 or 5-year-old son away a bit. Awkwardly wiping away the tears from his face, Simon realized that even though a soul with a difficult fate had completely lost control of the body, it still stubbornly refused to recall certain experiences, so stubborn that even if it had completely lost consciousness, it still stubbornly closed its heart and refused to let strangers peek. Then let's not think about it. Moreover, since I have obtained this body, I will definitely make this person's life shine brighter than anyone else's. Simon silently assured a certain soul in his heart. The consciousness in the dark may have heard his inner voice, and Simon found himself gradually calming down. After waiting in front of the rudimentary platform for about half an hour, a bus finally stopped at the roadside. It was a passing bus from downtown San Francisco. Simon leaned over and let the mother and son next to him get on the car first, then followed suit. The bus was almost full of passengers, and Simon walked back along the aisle until he finally found a vacant seat in the second-to-last row. A woman in a plaid shirt was already sitting inside their seats, with her long brown hair covering most of her face. She was looking down at a thick A4-bound book, holding a pen in her hand. Stuff the backpack onto the luggage rack, and Simon sits down in a vacant seat near the aisle. Feeling the commotion around her, the woman looked up and politely nodded at Simon before retracting her gaze again. Simon nodded in agreement, but his expression was somewhat unexpected as he knew the other person. To be precise, Simon knew the woman in front of him, but it was clearly impossible for the other person to know him. Kathryn Bigelow. The first female director in Hollywood history to win an Oscar for Best Director. Just this achievement is enough to make her a presence in film history. Let's set sail for a new book, ask for collection, ask for collection, ask for collection, and say important things 3 times, _, end of this chapter. Chapter 2. Butterfly Effect. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2 Butterfly Effect. Simon first met Kathryn Bigelow, a Hollywood female director, after winning the Oscar for Best Actress in 2010 in The Hurt Squad. Speaking of which, his first impression of Kathryn Bigelow was still the other person's appearance. At the 2010 Oscars, Kathryn Bigelow, dressed in a long linen silk dress and tall, looked only 30 years old, with a figure and temperament that could surpass most of the actresses on the red carpet back then. But in reality, Kathryn Bigelow was born in 1951. Even now in 1986, she is already 35 years old. Simon could only sigh that there is never a shortage of fairies in this world that can resist the erosion of time. Then it's the other party's work. After the Oscars that year, Simon specifically watched several films by Kathryn Bigelow. To be fair, most of the films directed by Kathryn Bigelow can only be described as mediocre, but the rough texture of the other party's works, like an ancient stone pillar totem, is impressive. This woman seems to be using all her masculine language to tell the audience in front of the screen that what men can do, I can do it too, and what men cannot do, I can still do it. Simon even felt that Kathryn Bigelow's portrayal of gender dominance through her own works had a somewhat addictive aura. The bus started again and headed south along California Highway 1. After a slight gesture earlier, Kathryn Bigelow focused all her attention on the manuscript in front of her. Simon glanced curiously and judged from the text format on the paper that the woman should have a script in her hand, and then did not disturb her. After more than an hour, it wasn't until Kathryn finished reading the last page of the manuscript that Simon timely spoke up and said, "Is this a script?" A woman's sixth sense is always very sensitive. Just as she was reading the script, Kathryn felt the young man beside her occasionally scrutinizing her. As a beautiful woman, she never lacks a matchmaker around her and has become accustomed to such things. However, The other party did not disturb her for just over an hour until she finished reading the script before speaking, which inexplicably added some favor to Catherine's heart. She smiled and nodded at Simon, saying, "Yes." Although she responded, Catherine did not have much willingness to talk to Simon. Although the young man in front of me has a sharp and handsome face, and a more mature temperament than his peers, no matter what, he is clearly just a young boy under 20 years old. If friends knew they had been approached by such a boy, they would definitely be laughed to death. Just as Catherine was about to turn her gaze to the outside of the car window and make a gesture of rejection, she heard the young man beside her continue, "Actually, I also have a script. How about we switch to watching to pass the time? It will take several more hours to get to Los Angeles." With these words, Simon quickly stood up, took off his backpack from the overhead luggage rack, and picked out one of the two manuscripts to show Catherine. Catherine felt a bit surprised when Simon casually pulled out a script, but still classified Simon's actions as a form of conversation in her heart. I had intended to explicitly refuse, but when I glanced at the title of Simon's script, she couldn't help but feel a little curious. She instinctively asked, "What does the butterfly effect mean?" This is a hypothetical idea made by Edward Lorenz, a professor of meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. To elaborate on his theory, Simon said, handing the script to Catherine and continuing, Professor Lorenz hypothesized that a butterfly in the Amazon basin of South America occasionally flapped its wings, and the impact of this flapping on the surrounding airflow continued to spread, causing a series of chain reactions that ultimately formed a terrifying tornado in Texas. Catherine listened attentively to Simon's explanation and couldn't help but shake her head. How could a butterfly flapping its wings cause a tornado? Simon said, "Professor Lawrence is using this to describe the enormous impact that a small variable may have on the entire system. And I think it's very possible, but we can't argue about it." Catherine let out a gentle hum and didn't argue with Simon. She wasn't someone who liked to argue with people. I discovered that I had unknowingly taken over the script called Butterfly Effect, so I curiously opened it. Then, I felt the young man beside me still looking at me, and then remembered what he had just said. After hesitating for a moment, I still handed over my own script. "Anyway," as he said, "let's just pass the time." Opening the script in her hand and taking a glance, she realized something and flipped through a few pages before Catherine finally confirmed. Originally, including the title on the cover, the entire script was handwritten in neat English fonts similar to print, which made her involuntarily glance at the young man next to her who had already shifted her attention to the script. In this era, typewriters have become a very common office tool. It is very rare for young people to patiently write over 100 pages of scripts and write them so beautifully. Simon was unaware of Catherine's psychological activities, and in fact, handwritten scripts were also his last resort. He lived in a mental hospital, and even if the doctor allowed him to own a typewriter, he couldn't afford it. Opening Catherine's script on her lap, Simon had already recognized it as Catherine's first feature film, Night of the Corpse. After The Bomb Disposal Unit won the award, he read the film's introduction out of curiosity when searching for information about Catherine, but did not spend time watching the movie. As the reading deepened, Simon quickly sorted out the general thread of the story in his hand. Oklahoma farm youth Calibo met a girl named May and fell in love with her at first sight, but May was actually a vampire and impulsively transformed Calibo into a vampire. Calibo was subsequently abducted by May's vampire companions and forced to roam the world. Although possessing the ability to live forever, after several twists and turns, Calibo realized that this was not the life he wanted, so he wanted to leave this group of vampires. At the same time, Calibo's father and sister also worked tirelessly to find their loved ones after he disappeared. On the other side, after reading the last page of the script for an unknown amount of time, Catherine looked up and found that Simon was still slowly flipping through his script, but suddenly had a small impulse in her heart to snatch the script from his hand. Although she doesn't really like the overly pessimistic and gloomy tone of The Butterfly Effect, looking at the entire story, Catherine has to admit that the intricately conceived and novel plot of The Butterfly Effect is much stronger than Blood Corpse Night. At the end of the day, Blood Corpse Night is just a simple romance film disguised as a vampire, with some script loopholes that even she herself is helpless with. Quietly waiting for Simon to finish flipping through the script, Catherine couldn't help but ask in a questioning voice that she wasn't even aware of. "How is it?" Simon thought for a moment and said, "I really like the scene of Caleb kneeling in front of May and sucking blood from her wrist, with a sense of unethical conduct that goes beyond ethics. This should be inspired by the phenomenon of lambs breastfeeding, and in the future, the camera will definitely be very touching." Catherine did not expect Simon to express her feelings based on a certain point in the script. Although the script for Blood Corpse Night was not entirely written by her, Simon's depiction of the scene at this time was precisely by her hand. Many movie fans will make an excessive deconstruction that completely goes beyond the director's intention after watching the movie, but Simon's understanding at this time coincides with her thoughts. She has a background in art, so she habitually adds symbolic shots in her scripts. So, after hesitating for a moment, Catherine asked bluntly, "Do you think there are any areas for improvement in this script?" Upon hearing the woman's question, Simon was somewhat surprised but quickly said, "Perhaps we can turn the farm into a ranch. I see there are many scenes from the farm in the script, but no farm in any state has more visual appeal than a ranch covered in green grass." Catherine thought for a moment, nodded, and then asked, "What about the final plot, which is the setting of Caleb and May turning back into humans? Do you think there's any better way to handle it? In the script of Blood Corpse Night, the male and female protagonists have transformed back into humans through blood transfusion, which is indeed a very far-fetched setting." However, Simon shook his head and said, "You should have modified the script many times already, haven't you? If you could, I wouldn't be able to see this kind of plot now. There's really no way to change it, otherwise the entire second half of the script would need to be overturned, which would definitely be another story." Catherine nodded, understanding that Simon was telling the truth, but her expression still showed some disappointment. Simon looked at the woman's expression and said, "Actually, there is still one place that can be adjusted." Catherine looked over again and said, "The name of the male protagonist," Simon said with a smile on his lips, "do you know? The name Caleb comes from Hebrew and actually means fierce hunting dog. This name is too tacky, it's best to change it." Catherine understood from Simon's smile that he was joking and smiled along, teasing, "You still know Hebrew?" "Yeah, it's quite fluent. So, I'm sure I'll do very well in Hollywood in the future. Hebrew is the national language of the Jewish people, and it is well known that Hollywood is the land of the Jewish people. Being able to speak fluent Hebrew will definitely win Simon the favor of many Jewish people in Hollywood." In fact, due to inheriting the memories of 12 other people, not only Hebrew, but also more proficient English and Chinese, Simon now knew German, French, and Spanish, which almost covered the world's most mainstream languages. So, even if he goes to do a translation now, he will definitely be the top type. Catherine listened to Simon's tone with a slight impulse to roll her eyes, and felt that the young man was shifting the topic and didn't want to comment more on the meaning of her script. Perhaps compared to his Butterfly Effect, Blood Corpse Night really has nothing to say. Simon is not unwilling to provide more advice to Catherine, as he is well versed in the strengths and weaknesses of Catherine's series of works. The key is that the two are still in a state of meeting by chance. Should she be advised to restrain the violent atmosphere of deliberately blurring gender awareness in her works and encourage her to showcase the delicate side that women should have? How do I know that a beautiful woman like her in a movie won't be delicate enough? Guess what? Talking too much will reveal the truth. However, Catherine was not a pushover either, so she followed Simon's previous topic with a hint of casual conversation and said, "So, what do you think would be a good name for Caleb?" "Simon, how are you doing?" Catherine was a bit puzzled. "Simon, is there anything special about this name?" Simon extended a hand to the woman and smiled. "Simon Westlow, may I know your name, madam?" Catherine suddenly understood that this was his name. My name is Catherine Bigelow. She gently shook hands with him, and Catherine also introduced herself with a smile. She said curiously, Westeros, this is a very rare surname. You know Hebrew, so is this a Jewish surname? No, Simon shook his head and said, this is my surname. Westeros is an original term created by George Martin, which should have appeared 10 years later. So, Simon is undoubtedly the only Westeros in the world now. Catherine could feel a faint sense of superiority implied in Simon's words, but there was no resentment in her heart. He is able to create scripts like The Butterfly Effect, speak eloquently about the theories of a professor at MIT, and master the very niche language of Hebrew. It is natural for such an outstanding young person to be proud. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. Catherine's Recommendation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. Catherine's Recommendation. After more than 7 hours of travel, the bus finally arrived at the terminus of this trip in the evening. After getting off the car, Simon stood on the street and looked around. Although he had never been here before, based on the information in his mind, he quickly determined that this should be the city of Burbank, located in the San Fernando Valley in northwest Los Angeles County, and he needed to cross the Santa Monica Mountains to the south to reach his ideal destination. On the other side of the mountain is Hollywood, the true geographical Hollywood. In the 1980s, although many Hollywood film studios had begun to migrate to the surrounding areas, more production companies, distribution companies, brokerage firms, and so on related to the film industry still gathered on the world-renowned streets of downtown Hollywood. Catherine got off the car behind Simon and stood on the roadside, looking around. She had agreed to pick up her friend before she arrived, so she looked at Simon next to her. I thought it would be a very boring journey because the appearance of this big boy became very fulfilling. After exchanging and reading the script, the two of them talked about many topics with great interest in the rest of their journey. Although much younger than herself, Catherine sometimes even felt that she was a novice girl in front of him. It's hard to imagine how this big boy accumulated such a wealth of knowledge. Whether it's movies, music, or even her professional painting, or many other topics, he can handle them with ease and talk freely. A few hours of interaction even gave her a feeling of great benefit. As they were about to part ways, Catherine suddenly realized that she knew almost nothing about Simon except for his name and his intention to become a screenwriter when he came to Los Angeles. However, he unconsciously guided her to reveal a lot of things, such as growing up in San Francisco, going back to visit her parents, living in the Soho district of Manhattan, and why she was interested in movies and wanted to become a director. If it was intentional, then it would be too despicable. However, upon careful consideration, it seems that she didn't ask these questions herself. Many of his topics have already overwhelmed her. Simon looked around and turned his head to Catherine. He saw that the woman happened to be looking at him, so he nodded and smiled at her. Along the way, Simon discovered a strong contrast between Catherine's personality and her film style. The characters in women's images often kill, set fire, and use foul language without any hesitation, living recklessly. However, Catherine's personality in life is very quiet, she speaks softly to people, and even appears very shy. Of course, Simon didn't feel too strange either. This intense personality conflict, which is almost schizophrenic between real life and personal works, is very common among various types of artist groups. With this in mind, Simon asked the woman, Catherine, isn't anyone here to pick you up? Yes, it's just that she hasn't come yet, Catherine said before she could conceive the words she had just wanted to say. When Simon spoke first, she shook her head and asked in reverse, what about you? Simon shrugged and said, I thought we could share a car and pay the fare. I live in Malibu, Catherine pointed west and said, where are you going? If it's on your way, I can take you there later. Malibu, that's a nice city, Simon said with a smile on his lips. Why don't you consider taking me in? I can cook, do laundry, and clean up all of these. Just manage to eat and stay. Catherine gave Simon a light glare, which was considered contemptuous of his desire for a soft meal, but then explained seriously, "I also stay with friends, but I don't have the right to take you in." Simon smiled, of course he was just joking. Even if Catherine really agreed, he would politely refuse. It's not because he can't eat Catherine's soft food, but because he has a deep-seated resistance to living in someone else's house, and he's more accustomed to living in his own house. Of course, this kind of thing may not be realized for a long time in the future. However, upon hearing Catherine say she was staying with a friend, Simon suddenly remembered. Friend. Is it James Cameron? In the original time and space, Catherine and Cameron were once husband and wife, and this incident was still very popular in the year when The Bomb Disposal Unit won the Oscar. The Bomb Disposal Unit versus Avatar, and her ex-wife versus ex-husband. After searching for information in his mind, Simon quickly rejected the speculation. Cameron's current wife is still Gail Ann Hurd, the producer of Terminator and also considered Cameron's beau. The two just got married last year, and although Cameron is not a stable man, they should not divorce until 3 or 4 years later. Catherine naturally didn't know Simon's thoughts, and after explaining, she said, "Simon, since you don't know anyone in Los Angeles and plan to become a screenwriter, you should need an agent, right? Maybe I can help." Although Simon had some plans of his own, he took Catherine's words seriously and said, "Is that okay, I mean, if it's not too much trouble?" "Of course not," Catherine shook her head and said, "but I can only recommend you. Can you persuade the other party to become your agent? You still need to work hard. WMA, do you know? That's a very good brokerage company." WMA, William Morris Agency, a talent agency founded in the late 19th century, is still the largest agency in Hollywood, as Simon naturally knows. Of course, according to the information Simon knows, WMA's current situation is definitely not good, but a skinny camel is bigger than a horse, and it's not a problem for WMA, an elephant that is still far from being skinny, to crush a large area of camels. If he could enter such a brokerage company, Simon would definitely avoid taking a long detour. After all, although many Hollywood stars always claim that they accidentally ran into an agent while shopping, eating, and walking, it seems like they have been thriving ever since. But don't doubt that 99% of these gossip is deceiving. If you don't believe it, feel free to open the IMDb page of a celebrity and see how many years they have gone through from their first appearance to becoming a popular representative work, to know how difficult their path to fame has been. Although Simon had unparalleled opportunities and resources, he had already made plans to stay in Hollywood for 3 to 5 years. He is only 18 years old this year and does not lack time. Of course, Catherine could offer him some help to the best of her ability at this moment, and Simon would never be too affected to refuse. The two walked together to a nearby coin-operated telephone booth, and Catherine searched through a phone book from her luggage for a while before finally dialing the number. Simon stood patiently waiting by the side. Catherine talked to the other person for a while, then turned around and whispered, "Simon, how do you spell Westeros?" Simon immediately spelled his surname once. Westeros. Catherine hummed, turned back, and talked for over a minute before hanging up the phone. "Fortunately, Mr. Friedman is still in the office, and I have forgotten that I have finished work now. However, WMA has been a bit chaotic lately, so it's not surprising to work overtime." Catherine said with some embarrassment, hurriedly writing something in her phone book from the pen booth, then tearing it off and handing it to Simon. She advised, "Tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock, William Morris headquarters, you must not be late. Tell them that you have an appointment at the front desk, and someone will take you there. If it's not possible, you can call this number." Simon nodded and took the note, glancing at it. At the top is a name, Jonathan Friedman, obviously Mr. Friedman as Catherine just mentioned. Next is 150, Camino Street, Beverly Hills, which should be the headquarters address of WMA. Finally, there is a string of phone numbers. Putting the note into his wallet and watching the woman pick up his shoulder bag, Simon suddenly remembered and said, Catherine, what about you? I mean, if I don't do well and I'm about to starve to death on the street, I have to know how to save you, right?" Upon hearing Simon's words, Catherine gave him a light glance and then took out her phone book again to start writing, while jokingly saying, "If you have hands and feet and can starve to death on the street, I won't care." As the two of them were speaking, several loud car horns suddenly sounded on the roadside. A burgundy Ford sedan came to a stop, and the woman in the driver's seat looked out of the window eagerly, saying to the two people, "Kate, I've caught you. Hey, little boy, get in the car, don't talk to the big sister on the roadside casually, you'll be dragged into the alley and eaten." Catherine handed Simon the written contact information and said helplessly to the woman in the car, "Jenny, you're late again. Maybe I shouldn't have come, I'm sure I'm disturbing you, right?" A woman named Jenny pushed open the car door and walked over with a smile, reaching out her hand to Simon. "Janet Johnston, little boy, what's your name?" Simon looked at the woman in front of him, wearing a pink tight-fitting T-shirt with a string of floral English letters printed on it, high-waisted jeans, and fluffy blonde hair draped over her shoulders. Although not as beautiful as Catherine, her figure in high heels also appeared quite tall and elegant. Her well-maintained appearance also made it difficult to tell her age. However, Simon clearly felt a hint of madness in the woman's personality. Besides, is it really good to wear high heels while driving? With this in mind, Simon politely shook hands with the other person and introduced himself, Simon Westlow. "Strange surname," Janet Johnston muttered, then looked up and down at Simon with a very satisfied expression before turning to Catherine and saying, "So, Kate, let's take him home." Catherine put her luggage in the back seat of the roadside car and walked over, saying, "Jenny, don't joke, let's go." Janet clearly didn't intend to easily let go of the two of them. She reached out and grabbed Catherine's arm to prevent her from leaving, but her gaze was fixed on Simon, curious, and said, "Little boy, it seems like you just arrived in Los Angeles with Kate. I guess your home is also in San Francisco, right? Which city did I ask for Kate?" Simon looked over at Catherine with some curiosity and thought for a moment before saying, "Probably, San Jose." Janet gave Simon a disgruntled glance and dragged her voice, saying, "It's really interesting, probably." Simon shrugged and wrote lightly, "I don't have a home, I just grew up in San Jose." How could someone not have a home? Janet, who was thick and straight, didn't react for a moment and ignored Catherine's small movements, pulling her arm, asking after her, "So where did you live before coming to Los Angeles?" Simon curved the corner of his mouth and gave a harmless smile, saying, "Watson's Mental Hospital." End of this chapter. Chapter 4. The Turbulent William Morris. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. The turbulent William Morris. Unconsciously, the surroundings were already in twilight, and the lights on both sides of the street lit up. Simon looked at two women in front of him who were stunned and hesitant, and could only lightly remind them that they should indeed go back. Marabou, located in the western suburbs of Los Angeles, was still far from Burbank. Finally, it is suggested that Catherine drive, as Janet Johnston driving in high heels is too dangerous. Seeing that Simon was functioning normally without any signs of illness, Catherine finally felt relieved, but inexplicably refused to explore Simon's past. Glancing at her friend who was still turning her eyes but finally calmed down next to her, Catherine felt a bit amused. "Let's finally cure you for not being serious all day." The female hooligan who pretended to be crazy met a real lunatic who came out of a mental hospital, TSK. Pushing her friend into the passenger seat, Catherine also got into the car and hesitated for a moment. The woman still reminded Simon, who was standing outside the car window, to contact her if he had any difficulties before starting the car. Turning around at the nearby intersection, Catherine finally nodded at the big boy on the side of the road and slowly stepped on the accelerator. The burgundy Ford sedan gradually merged into the city traffic in the twilight. Watching the two women's cars go far away, Simon lifted his backpack from his shoulder and turned around to leave. Simon bought a map of downtown Los Angeles from a nearby store, sat down in an outdoor seat at a street fast food restaurant, ordered the cheapest dinner, and began flipping through the map. Because he inherited the memories of 12 other people, Simon found that not only those professional skills, but also various information about Hollywood, or the entire Los Angeles, from cultural geography to entertainment gossip, all over the decades, Simon was completely familiar with it. It seems that I still have the potential to be a paparazzi. With such self-entertainment, Simon easily found the headquarters of WMA on the map. Camino Street happens to be located not far from the intersection of Wilshire Avenue and Santa Monica Avenue, the busiest part of Beverly Hills. Nearby is Century City Park, where media companies gather. 20th Century Fox Studios is located, and WMA's arch-rival CAA headquarters is also not far away. After marking the location of WMA headquarters, Simon found the headquarters address of the Writers Guild of America and circled it casually. The waiter served dinner, Simon filled his stomach, checked out, and walked out of the restaurant. Then he began to worry about how to leave Burbank. In the 1980s, Los Angeles had neither buses nor subways, and taxis were also scarce, requiring phone reservations. After wandering on the street with a lucky mentality for half an hour, Simon realized that he underestimated the lack of public transportation in Los Angeles and regretted not having the audacity to ask Catherine to give him a ride. Helpless, I had to stay at a hotel in Burbank. The next morning, with the help of the hotel owner, Simon booked a taxi by phone. After bargaining with the driver who arrived, he finally paid $15 with a tip before being sent to West Hollywood on the other side of Santa Monica Mountain. Standing on the side of Melrose Avenue, although there was still a considerable distance from the destination, in order to save money, Simon had to walk for the rest of the day. Following the map's guidance, walk south along the north-south Fairfax Avenue that intersects with Melrose Avenue for over 20 minutes before arriving outside the Writers Guild of America, WGA, building. Simon naturally didn't come here to join the Writers Guild. He doesn't have this qualification yet, mainly to register the copyright of the script in his backpack. According to federal copyright law, theoretically, creators automatically obtain copyright upon completion of their work. But in reality, once a legal dispute arises, whether to proceed with copyright registration becomes crucial evidence. In the United States, there are many ways to register copyright, and even some private registration agencies. The most authoritative one among them is naturally the Copyright Office, but due to the well-known low work efficiency of U.S. government departments, submitting registration to the Copyright Office may take creators 4 to 6 months to obtain the copyright certificate, and the review process is extremely slow. Therefore, in Hollywood, registering copyright through WGA has become the first choice for most screenwriters. Prepare the materials and registration fees, and you can basically receive the registration certificate on the same day. Of course, registering with WGA also has its drawbacks, which is that it will only keep the registration materials for creators for 5 to 10 years, and renewal is required upon expiration. However, registration with the Copyright Office is permanent, and legal disputes can provide more comprehensive protection. After careful consideration, Simon still chose to submit all the 2 scripts he had already completed for registration. The registration fee for a single script is $20, and the cost of printing materials for 2 scripts has once again depleted Simon's wallet. Leaving the WGA building and thinking of the afternoon meeting, Simon made a copy of the script for The Butterfly Effect, and then picked out an electronic watch priced at less than $2 from a roadside stall. After finishing all these tasks, it's already past noon. Simply buying a portion of food to fill his stomach, Simon rechecked his wallet, and yesterday's $198 had quickly dropped to less than $97. There was some helplessness, but not too much panic. The most serious situation is just wandering on the streets, and the likelihood of starving to death is still very low. It's best to find a church to grab some free food vouchers. The agreed time is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. To ensure everything is safe, Simon arrived near the WMA headquarters half an hour in advance. The WMA headquarters building on Camino Street is a very modern-looking fiberglass structure building. Although the floor is not high, it appears quite imposing compared to other mediocre commercial buildings around it. There is also a small square in front of the building, which undoubtedly demonstrates WMA's outstanding position in Hollywood at this time. Approaching 4 o'clock, Simon stepped into WMA headquarters 5 minutes early. "Explain your purpose to the front desk receptionist of the company, who has called." A moment later, a white young man who appeared to be under 30 years old greeted him. The young man was dressed in a professional white shirt and black trousers, thin and tall, with gold-rimmed glasses. He meticulously took care of his dark brown hair and looked polite. The two briefly introduced that Simon knew each other's name was Owen Wright, who was Jonathan Friedman's assistant, and then followed the opposite direction towards the interior of the building. Strolling through the spacious corridor adjacent to the glass curtain wall, Simon noticed that the surrounding WMA employees were either hurriedly walking or frowning, and some noticed his unfamiliar face with a slightly wary expression in their eyes. Simon did not feel too surprised by this situation. According to the information he knows, WMA has been experiencing a very serious turbulence in the past few months. In the first half of this year, WMA's chairman and CEO Maurice Stoller and President Stan Carman passed away one after another. The job vacancies caused by the deaths of two core executives not only sparked a power struggle within the company, but also led brokerage firms such as CAA and ICM to take advantage of the turmoil in the WMA and boldly start wielding their hoes to dig for opportunities. Especially after the death of Stan Carman, the Hollywood gold medalist agent's top stars such as Al Pacino, Warren Beatty, Barbra Streisand, and Goldie Hawn all switched jobs to CAA, which directly damaged WMA's morale. Simon followed Owen Wright to an office and waited in the lounge for a moment. A middle-aged white man with slightly grayish hair pushed the door in from outside. A middle-aged person looks around 40 or 50 years old, dressed in a gray suit, not too tall, just over 1.7 meters tall, with a thin figure, deep eye sockets, wide nose bridge, black hair, and a typical Jewish appearance. In fact, Friedman is clearly a Jewish surname. "Sorry, just finished a meeting." Jonathan Friedman walked straight toward Simon when he saw him get up. He looked at Simon with a faint gaze, a gentle smile on his face, and politely extended his hand to him, saying, "So, Simon Westlow." Simon nodded and shook hands with the other person, saying, "Hello, Mr. Friedman. Nice to meet you." Jonathan Friedman nodded in response and made a gesture of invitation. The two of them walked into the nearby office together, and the middle-aged man said in a familiar tone, "I heard the surname, Westeros, for the first time, so I immediately remembered it." "Simon, this is your advantage. It's not easy to be remembered in Hollywood." Simon just smiled and didn't say anything. Jonathan Friedman gestured for Simon to sit across from his desk. After sitting down, he relaxed his arms on the table and casually crossed his arms to look at the young man across from him. Height is around 180 cm, very standard. His face has sharp edges, brown hair, and lacks the childishness of a teenage actor, making him very photogenic. Black T-shirt, jeans, simple clothing, but with a calm confidence that surpasses peers, it is very attractive to the opposite sex. The potential embryo of red offspring. There is a potential for development towards the Tom Cruise genre, and the recent box office success of Brave has really attracted too much attention. However, this boy is actually a screenwriter. Jonathan Friedman suddenly had less expectations. A good screenwriter requires experience, and Jonathan Friedman does not believe that a young man in his 20s can write any excellent scripts. Even he had some doubts that the young man had figured out how to write a legitimate Hollywood script format. In fact, Jonathan Friedman is not familiar with Catherine. Apart from occasional encounters at some Hollywood gatherings, the recent intersection between the two is only one of Friedman's clients vying for the male lead in Catherine's upcoming film. It is precisely for this reason that Jonathan Friedman agreed to today's meeting after receiving a recommendation call from Catherine, which can be considered as a favor for the beautiful woman who has a certain say in the film casting. Jonathan Friedman's original plan was to casually recommend the person Catherine introduced to the literary agency of WMA if they were good enough. After all, even first-line Hollywood screenwriters often bring less income to agents than a second-line actor, and he has no plans to personally represent a screenwriter. If it doesn't work, anyway, the favor is sufficient, so it's not inappropriate to refuse directly. But at this moment, seeing Simon himself, Jonathan Friedman already had some thoughts of sending Simon away as soon as possible. He has just been promoted to vice president of WMA this month, and the company has been in chaos recently. At this time, he is not in the mood to perfunctory a young person who is ambitious. Of course, Jonathan Friedman did not express such thoughts. He has always believed that to be an excellent agent, it is necessary to always maintain a humble attitude. After a brief evaluation in his heart, Jonathan Friedman's tone remained gentle, with a hint of encouragement and anticipation, and he said, "So, Simon, let's talk about your script first." End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Only worth 10 minutes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Only worth 10 minutes. Simon took out the script for Butterfly Effect from his backpack and handed it to Jonathan Friedman. Jonathan Friedman did not open it, just glanced at the cover and pressed the script onto the table, continuing to look at him with a smile. In that case, Simon sorted out his thoughts and began to explain, "This is a soft science fiction suspenseful thriller. From a very young age, people around Ivan often found that this child would do very strange or even eerie things for no reason. However, Ivan always claimed to have no memory of the situation afterwards. The doctor classified Ivan's condition as intermittent amnesia and recommended him to use diary writing as an auxiliary treatment." Simon said this and noticed that Jonathan Friedman's expression had already shown a hint of curiosity, so he continued. The general plot idea of Butterfly Effect is a story about a young person who has the ability to go back to the past by reading a diary. In order to make up for his past regrets, he travels through time and space repeatedly trying to change his life. However, every time the male protagonist tries to change the past, when he returns to the age of 20, he finds that everything around him has not developed according to his imagined situation, and even becomes worse. The biggest feature of The Butterfly Effect is its rigorous plot that is intricately intertwined and stunning. The entire story is like a well-designed web, where all details can find corresponding nodes elsewhere. Therefore, this film is considered a classic in the hearts of many suspense and thriller enthusiasts. In the original time and space, the production company of Butterfly Effect was New Line Cinema, and Simon heard that the film had many endings during the editing process. However, what he ultimately chose was the darkest and most impactful one among them. The male protagonist, after trying time and time again but failing, returned to his mother's womb in despair and strangled himself with his umbilical cord. Then the whole story came to an abrupt end. Simon finished his description, but Jonathan Friedman, who had no expectations of him, fell into silence. Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future, first installment was just released last year and won the annual box office championship in 1985. Therefore, Simon's script, which shares elements of time travel with Back to the Future, far exceeded Jonathan Friedman's expectations. He even felt that the story was even better in terms of pure conception than Back to the Future. At least for now, just such a novel script concept is enough to convince him to recommend Simon to the literary agency of WMA. It should be noted that Hollywood is also plagued by a lot of following trends, but due to the generally long production cycle of Hollywood movies, it does not give people the feeling of a cluster of films of the same genre being released in the second half of the year. Therefore, with Back to the Future winning last year's box office championship, Simon's idea, as long as it is accompanied by a relatively complete script, can definitely arouse strong interest from Hollywood film companies. In addition, such a uniquely conceived horror film happens to be the type of project that Jonathan Friedman is currently looking for. The key now is, what is the quality of the script in hand? After all, Hollywood never lacks creativity. What is lacking is a perfect storyline that can be transformed into exciting films based on relevant creativity. Many Hollywood movies usually go through years of lengthy revisions during the script creation stage, mainly because there are too many details that need to be adjusted between a playable script and the original story creativity. Quickly pondering in his mind, Jonathan Friedman lowered his head and glanced at the script cover in his hand. Subconsciously, he asked a question similar to Catherine's yesterday. "Simon, can you explain the meaning of the butterfly effect first?" Simon nodded and explained once again the theory of Professor Edward Lorenz at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After listening, Jonathan Friedman asked a somewhat surprising question. "So, have you ever attended MIT?" "No," Simon shook his head, but immediately added, "I entered Stanford last year and received a full scholarship, but dropped out early due to some unforeseen circumstances." Simon said this, Jonathan Friedman's expression showed a noticeable change. Although Stanford University is not part of the Ivy League in the United States, in reality, this top university located on the west coast of the United States has surpassed most of its members in terms of overall strength, and has a significant place in the world university rankings. Simon was able to enter Stanford University in the form of a full scholarship, and even though he had dropped out at the time, this qualification would definitely elevate Jonathan Friedman's evaluation of him several levels. Simon also understood in his heart that he was actually conducting an interview right now. Westerners do not emphasize humility. The better a person performs during an interview, the more likely they are to increase their success rate. Therefore, Simon did not hesitate to utilize his qualifications at this time. After Simon finished speaking, Jonathan Friedman glanced at his watch with a hesitant expression and spoke up at the right time, "Mr. Friedman, the first 10 pages of the script are the story outline I made. Maybe you can take a look first, it's more detailed than what I just told." Jonathan Friedman nodded at the words, no longer hesitating, and happily opened the script in front of him. However, the content on the first page of the script once again stunned him, but it was a copyright registration certificate from the Writers Guild of America. With a slight shake of his head and a smile, Jonathan Friedman flipped over casually, but his initial perception of Simon completely changed in his heart. The young man across from him is obviously not the one with a hot head who would crash into Hollywood and think he could soar to fame. Later on, seeing the English handwriting that was still beautiful and neat despite being a photocopy, Jonathan Friedman did not feel too surprised. Of course, the evaluation of Simon in my heart inevitably increased a lot again. Hollywood may face more copyright disputes each year than the movies it produces, and simply posting WGA's copyright registration certificate on the front page is also Simon's helpless move. He wouldn't be naive enough to think that industry giants like WMA wouldn't be able to make the small act of embezzling someone else's script. Simon cannot withstand such setbacks now, so he decided to cut off some possible disputes from the source. In fact, as Jonathan Friedman thought, although he inherited the memories of the other 12, Simon was definitely not the kind of stunned youth who thought he could make a name for himself by stepping into Hollywood. Simon had already started planning very meticulously since the initial idea of rushing to Los Angeles for an adventure. Although he has a decent appearance, Simon has no intention of following the path of an actor. His first stage goal is to become a director, but without any qualifications and connections, this is clearly unlikely in the short term. So, starting with a screenwriter with a slightly lower threshold is a very good choice. According to some information in Simon's memory, the two major screenwriting unions on the east and west coasts of Hollywood register over 60,000 scripts annually, which seems to be a very large number. But in Hollywood as a whole, there is no problem with the total number of low-cost independent films from all theaters, TV shows, and direct distribution of videotapes exceeding 600 each year. A success rate of 1% is already very high in Simon's view. Moreover, among the tens of thousands of scripts that appear every year, mediocre ones still make up the majority. But as a traveler, the scripts that Simon can come up with are basically exquisite works after being washed away by the waves. Moreover, during the initial selection process of the script, Simon carefully weighed various factors. As a newcomer to Hollywood, in order to ensure that his script is appreciated by the film company as much as possible, the first step must be low-cost production. If Simon takes out the script for Titanic now, there is a 99% chance that it will be directly thrown into the trash can. Secondly, the story must be novel enough to be eye-catching. Finally, it is best for the script creativity to cover the popular elements of some box office blockbusters in recent years. The butterfly effect perfectly aligns with the above three principles. Low cost, new creativity, and following the trend of time-traveling elements. Last year's box office champion, Back to the Future. In the office, as Jonathan Friedman read, the surroundings fell silent for a moment. When the knocking on the door reminded him, Jonathan Friedman realized that he had unknowingly started reading the main text of the script. The script text in the standard Hollywood format also appears impeccable, and the beautiful handwritten English not only has no sense of conflict, but also creates a more comfortable reading experience. Immersed in reading and suddenly disturbed by someone, Jonathan Friedman looked up somewhat displeased and found his assistant Owen Wright standing by the door making a gesture to him, which made him realize. After looking at his schedule, Jonathan Friedman said to his assistant, "If Courtney doesn't have anything else to do, let her wait for a while. The same goes for future appointments, and I'll be a bit late for work today." Upon hearing this, Owen Wright looked at Simon, who was sitting with his back to him, and nodded as he was about to leave the office. Jonathan Friedman stopped him and ordered, "Also, bring in 2 cups of coffee." As the door closed again, Jonathan Friedman smiled at Simon without explaining anything, but redirected his attention to the script in front of him. Simon didn't mind either and casually glanced at the electronic watch on his wrist. The current time is 4:13. That is to say, Jonathan Friedman should have only reserved 10 minutes of meeting time for himself. If his performance was not satisfactory, he may have been dismissed now. Simon had no grudges about this, and he would probably have done the same himself. Politeness is a person's cultivation, but work should still follow the rules. He is still an unknown Hollywood rookie, naturally only worth 10 minutes. Owen Wright quickly brought in 2 cups of coffee. Simon took them and thanked him, continuing to patiently wait for Jonathan Friedman to read the script. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. I am very curious about your age. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. I am very curious about your age. More than 20 minutes later, after reading the script for more than half, Jonathan Friedman forcibly stopped the idea of continuing reading. There are other tasks to do today, and it's not a good time to read the script. Moreover, although only half of it is read, Jonathan Friedman has determined that the quality of the script for Butterfly Effect is definitely as excellent as its storyline creativity. If it could be filmed, it would definitely become a very classic film. Of course, with Jonathan Friedman's professional perspective, the shortcomings of this script are also very obvious. Firstly, the name, Butterfly Effect, appears too niche. Most ordinary people still cannot understand the professional theoretical terminology proposed in the 1970s, which undoubtedly hinders many people's interest in films. However, just after Simon explained the meaning of the butterfly effect, Jonathan Friedman couldn't find any other more appropriate name for a while, and this point could only be temporarily put on hold. Secondly, the overall style of the story is too dark. Especially at the end of the story, the scene where the male protagonist returns to his mother's body and strangles himself with his umbilical cord, upon careful consideration, even gives off a chilling feeling. However, the entire script also perfectly fits the style of the client's work. During the reading process just now, Jonathan Friedman was actually using his mind to calculate certain ideas. Due to the internal turmoil of WMA Company, a large number of customers have fled, and Jonathan Friedman has also been affected. Brian De Palma, a well-known Hollywood director under his name who has directed films such as Carrie the Witch and Scarface, has recently been invited to switch jobs at the CAA. According to the information he received, the CAA has even prepared a project as a welcome gift. The reason why Brian De Palma did not leave as decisively as Al Pacino, Barbra Streisand, and others was mainly due to some of the friendships cultivated through years of collaboration. However, in recent years, Brian De Palma's 2 consecutive blockbuster films with investments exceeding tens of millions of dollars have both ended in failure. As an agent, if he cannot find a high-quality project with sufficient box office guarantees for the other party as soon as possible, Jonathan Friedman believes he will soon lose this client. Now, the butterfly effect seems perfectly fitting. Enough innovative creativity, exciting storylines, and at the same time, it is the thriller genre that Brian De Palma excels at. Moreover, from the perspective of the storyline, the budget for the film is not too high, which undoubtedly makes it easier for the studio to initiate a project. All these favorable elements add up, and Jonathan Friedman believes that the butterfly effect has very little chance of failure, not even much worse than Brian De Palma's famous work, The Witch Carrie, back then. Moreover, as a group play with a variety of characters, this film can be used to promote young artists under its own name. Since CAA can create a series of successful packaging projects, the overall strength is no less than CAA's WMA, and there is no reason why they cannot replicate the other party's experience. Now, the low-budget and low-risk butterfly effect can clearly be a good attempt at packaging projects. After weighing all the details, Jonathan Friedman finally looked up at the young man across from him. Perhaps occasionally signing a movie screenwriter is also a good choice. Having made up his mind, Jonathan Friedman spoke again and said, "So, Simon, do you have any other scripts?" Simon listened to Jonathan Friedman's tone and understood that his trip today was worth it. However, since The Butterfly Effect has already piqued Jonathan Friedman's interest, he does not intend to immediately bring out another script as it will only distract the agent's attention during the script promotion process. In fact, Simon had originally planned to submit scripts every 1 to 2 months as long as he could find an agent. Nevertheless, in order to continue to increase his weight in Jonathan Friedman's mind, Simon replied with certainty, "Yes, but the script is still being perfected and will take some time." This is a story about death, combined with some Eastern fatalistic perspective. In the Eastern view, they believe that if death confirms a person's death date, then that person will never escape the entanglement of death. Jonathan Friedman originally only casually asked politely, but Simon's words once again piqued his interest. However, Simon did not continue, and Jonathan Friedman stopped asking further questions. There will definitely be many opportunities for chatting in the future, but now we still need to solve the current situation. Since that's the case, let's talk about signing the contract. Simon, since you have done so much preparation work, I believe you also have some understanding of signing with a brokerage company. Let's talk about your requirements first. Simon nodded politely and said, "Firstly, I only write scripts that interest me and do not accept commissioned scripts or long-term employment. Therefore, I hope to only sign a simple script agency contract." Just listening to Simon's first request, Jonathan Friedman couldn't help but want to shake his head. The total number of Hollywood's annual film and television programs based on original scripts is only a few hundred. If we rely solely on original scripts for a living, the 2 major writers' unions on the east and west coasts of North America, combined with over 10,000 members, may starve to death. Therefore, the majority of Hollywood screenwriters rely on various adaptations of scripts, commissioned tasks such as script doctors, and long-term employment by film and television production companies for their livelihoods. Simon's request at this time is equivalent to limiting his personal career to a very narrow range. I originally wanted to explain, but looking at the young face across from me, Jonathan Friedman still chose to dispel this idea. Since you are young and reckless, it is better to experience more setbacks. Simon could probably understand Jonathan Friedman's thoughts from his facial expression, but without pause, he continued, "Secondly, if conditions permit, I would like to try working as a film director, so I hope to reserve some autonomy in my script. Jonathan Friedman still felt his corner of the eye jump and looked at Simon again before finally saying, "Actually, Simon, I'm very curious about your age." Simon took out his wallet and handed over his driver's license, saying, "Mr. Friedman, although I don't intend to hide this from you, I still feel that in the process of promoting the script, you need to avoid discussing my personal age with the executives of the film company." Jonathan Friedman took Simon's driver's license and glanced at the date of birth on it. February 22, 1968. Although he had a clear idea, Jonathan couldn't help but glance at the date on the display screen of his desk computer. Today is June 19, 1986. That is to say, the little guy in front of me just turned 18 at the beginning of this year. Some shook their heads and smiled helplessly, handing their driver's license back to Simon. Jonathan Friedman said, "Okay, I'll try to ignore this as much as possible next. However, Simon, you know, most Hollywood directors only get their first chance to direct movies after the age of 30, so you're still 2. Simon couldn't wait for Jonathan Friedman to finish speaking before shaking his head and interrupting, "You're wrong, Joe. Steven Spielberg isn't, Martin Scorsese isn't, George Lucas isn't, and Francis Ford Coppola isn't either. Since that's the case, why should I do those mediocre majority?" Jonathan Friedman was momentarily stunned. Until many years later, Jonathan Friedman still vividly remembered one afternoon in the summer of 1986, the spirited young man's resounding words in his office. "Steven Spielberg is not, Martin Scorsese is not, George Lucas is not, Francis Ford Coppola is not either." He didn't even know that at that time, the young man had less than $100 left in his pocket. If he couldn't find a job to make a living soon, he might have to camp on the streets. After a while, Jonathan Friedman regained his senses and began discussing the signing with Simon. Simon had already left a deep impression on him during this meeting, and Jonathan Friedman couldn't help but no longer impose too harsh signing conditions on Simon as a newcomer. In fact, ultimately, the height that a screenwriter can reach in Hollywood is limited, and the benefits it brings to agents are relatively insignificant compared to agents at the level of Jonathan Friedman. Jonathan Friedman instinctively felt that giving this young man some convenience at this moment might lead to unexpected gains in the future. Therefore, the two quickly agreed on the basic contractual framework. A simple script agency contract with a signing period of 3 years and a commission of 10%. Simon has a certain degree of autonomy over his own script. Simply put, if he wants to personally direct his own script, he doesn't need to prepare the project through his agent. The detailed contract content will naturally not be so simple, so Simon needs to come back tomorrow to sign. Finally, in order to ease Jonathan Friedman's obvious fear of himself just now, Simon took the initiative to explain a few words, stating that his next goal is only to make some ultra-low-cost experimental movies as exercise. It's probably a 16mm camera, a few $1,000s, and 2 or 3 people. Jonathan Friedman was indeed more willing to accept Simon's argument and even offered to provide some help to the best of his ability. The two of them had a great conversation, and by the time the meeting ended, it had unknowingly passed 5:40. Saying goodbye to Jonathan Friedman, who personally escorted him to the office door again, Simon turned around and found 2 young men and a woman waiting in the lounge outside. As the office door opened, the 3 people who were originally chatting stood up respectfully and couldn't help but look at Simon, who had kept them waiting for over an hour. The 2 young men looked with obvious envy and vigilance, and the black short-haired girl also looked curiously at Simon. Simon just nodded slightly to the 3 of them, although he felt that the short-haired girl looked familiar. He didn't think much and walked out. Until leaving the WMA headquarters building, Simon remembered a name mentioned by Jonathan Friedman over an hour ago and realized that the short-haired girl should be Courtney Cox, the famous Monica Geller with OCD from Friends. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Hitchhiking. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Hitchhiking, curiously watching the boy leave, Jonathan Friedman shouted in her ear before she quickly walked towards the agent's office. Jonathan just gestured for her to sit down first and then began whispering something to Owen Wright, who was also called in. She could only continue to patiently wait, afraid to show any dissatisfaction, but also envied the boy just now in her heart. Is it a descendant of a Hollywood family who can receive such a solemn hospitality from Jonathan? This idea was immediately overturned by her, and the other person's attire didn't look like a wealthy person no matter what. Although pretending nothing was happening, she still heard clearly that Jonathan had asked Owen to prepare a contract based on his memo and to take a copy of a script, which was obviously related to the boy just now. He's really a lucky guy. Fortunately, he's a boy and won't compete with himself. It's just that Pasta and his team will have opponents in the future. Thinking this way, I felt a little schadenfreude in my heart. Jonathan didn't talk about her until Owen left. After all, NBC decided to cut off The Amazing Agents, which was her first time starring in a TV series. But she wasn't too disappointed either. She still wanted to become a movie star and participated in TV dramas just to accumulate experience. Jonathan has recently been promoted to Vice President of WMA. Although talent agencies can easily secure a vice president position for agents with top clients, the vice president of WMA should still be able to bring himself more opportunities. The agent did not disappoint her as expected. Warner Pictures is preparing a fantasy comedy called Beetlejuice with a budget of $15 million. This is a big production, and the production cost of Brave is only $15 million. Jonathan has helped her win an audition for one of the most important supporting role. In addition, there is an audition for the female lead in a MGM TV movie, all scheduled for next week. After discussing the matter, she left happily with 2 audition materials. I picked up my car from the parking lot, turned onto Camino Street, and after some thought, I decided to head south and take Olympic Avenue back to Santa Monica. It's the peak rush hour now, and the Wilshire Avenue to the north can definitely block people. The traffic on Olympic Avenue was indeed sparse. She drove forward for 2 or 3 minutes, about to leave the scope of Century City, but unexpectedly found a figure not far ahead. A cheap black T-shirt, slightly whitewashed jeans, and a light gray canvas backpack. Obviously, it was that guy. Moreover, his shabby attire of Luo-Tua walked along the flowing urban road in the sunset, giving people a feeling of wandering around the world, like a lonely wandering poet. Her gaze was drawn, and she unconsciously slowed down and leaned towards the roadside. This guy has a great physique. With such a shallow thought in her mind, she pressed the car window and greeted the figure on the roadside, "Hi." Leaving the headquarters of WMA, Simon called a woman from a phone booth on the street using the contact information left by Catherine, wanting to tell her that he had confirmed his contract with Jonathan Friedman. The phone was not answered, and Simon could only choose to leave a message. Then we began to plan our next steps. It is definitely impossible to rent a house temporarily, and one can only choose to stay in a hotel. If we only consider the price, there will naturally be many places to go. But in Los Angeles, security issues are a matter that must be treated with great caution. Moreover, he doesn't have a car, so he can't live too far from the WMA headquarters. After some deliberation between Hollywood in the north and Santa Monica in the east, Simon decided to go to Santa Monica. In my memory, there are many cheap motels on both sides of the 405 highway that runs between Beverly Hills and Santa Monica City. Determined, Simon headed south along Camino Street and then turned towards Olympic Avenue. The city of Santa Monica is about 6 or 7 kilometers away from here, and it takes at most an hour to walk. Simon is not in a hurry either. After walking for about 20 minutes, Simon felt a white sedan slowly approaching him, feeling somewhat puzzled. A girl's greeting could be heard from the window that had fallen. The driver's seat is on the left, and Simon lowered his head to look inside the car, only to find Courtney Cox, whom he had just met at WMA. Entering Hollywood, Simon will also sign contracts with brokerage giants like WMA. He knows that he will definitely come into contact with many faces that used to only be seen on the big screen, so he doesn't have any special feelings for Monica from Friends just now. At this moment, when Courtney Cox took the initiative to greet him, Simon was somewhat surprised but still politely replied, "Hello." Courtney Cox saw the boy outside the car window with bright eyes looking at her and made a random gesture before saying, "Well, we just met in Jonathan's office. I live in Santa Monica. Do you want a ride?" "Okay, thank you." Simon nodded with a smile, and the road teeth under his feet were painted in bold red, which was a no parking sign, so he didn't hesitate and reached out to open the car door. Courtney Cox collected the audition materials that had just been placed on the passenger seat and threw them into the back seat. When Simon came in and sat down, she immediately stepped on the gas pedal. After the car was driving smoothly, Courtney lifted her eyes and glanced at the boy next to her through the rearview mirror, saying, "My name is Courtney Cox, and you?" "Simon Westlow." Simon answered, his gaze also fixed on the girl beside him through the rearview mirror. At this time, Courtney Cox was in her early 20s, with short hair cut like a tomboy and a slightly thin face, so her eyes appeared large, giving a lively feeling. Although she is very beautiful, it is difficult to conceal her youthful charm, lacking some of the charm from later Friends. "Oh," Courtney nodded and withdrew her gaze from the rearview mirror, looking at the road ahead to find a topic. "So, are you familiar with Jonathan?" Simon shook his head and said, "No, it's just an introduction from a friend. It's our first time meeting today. So you're really amazing. You talked to Jonathan for over an hour when we first met. Did you just arrive in Los Angeles and plan to become an actor?" "No, I'm a screenwriter." Courtney turned her head in surprise and glanced at Simon, then quickly withdrew her gaze and said, "That's even more impressive." After all, it was their first contact, and the two were just chatting aimlessly. A few minutes later, the car crossed the 405 highway and entered the downtown area of Santa Monica. Continuing forward for less than a kilometer, Simon signaled for Courtney to stop and put herself down. Saying goodbye to the girl, Simon began searching for a place to stay on the streets of Santa Monica City. As Simon remembered, there were indeed many nearby motels. However, upon learning that Simon did not have any type of bank card and wanted to stay for a long time but was unable to pay a sufficient deposit in advance, most hotels turned Simon away. After searching for several blocks, Simon finally found a hotel willing to accept him in the alleys near the southern edge of the city. "Because I introduced myself, my boss named Diego Sacadu is Hispanic, in his 60s, and he is also a first-generation immigrant." After listening to the boss's heavily accented English, Simon tried to communicate with the other person in Spanish and ended up having a great conversation. Finally, the boss agreed to rent a single room on the second floor of the hotel near the road to Simon for $100 per week. Simon only needs to pay a deposit of $50 first, and the subsequent rent can be paid once a week. It was obvious that Simon was in a tight financial situation, and the boss kindly reminded him not to leave a tip for the person cleaning the room, as this was all done by his wife. The whole process once again made Simon realize the truth of how important it is to master a foreign language. The signing took a whole day the next day. In order to avoid any clauses that caught him off guard, Simon carefully studied the more than 20-page contract several times. Although he can't afford a lawyer now, fortunately, the relevant information in his memory is sufficient. Finally, some details were discussed again with Jonathan Friedman. After signing the agency contract, the next thing to do is to wait. Even though Jonathan Friedman is optimistic about the script for The Butterfly Effect, script sales are definitely not something that can be completed overnight. Many scripts may even be stuck in the hands of agents for several years, and Simon is mentally prepared for this situation. However, despite signing a 3-year contract with Jonathan Friedman, Simon will not be 100% unprepared to hang himself on the tree of WMA. There is also a restrictive clause in the detailed contract content. If Jonathan Friedman cannot reach a deal with the film company after Simon submits 3 consecutive scripts, Simon has the right to terminate the agency relationship with the other party after the 3rd script is submitted for 3 months and the complete contract period exceeds 9 months. After securing the contract with WMA, Simon began to focus on his livelihood issues. In fact, Simon is clearly more adept at this aspect than anything else. In just 2 days, Simon found a job at a sizable supermarket in the downtown area of Santa Monica. This 24-hour operating supermarket called Griffin Supermarket should be a non-chain independent store. When Roger Griffin, a middle-aged and overweight owner who interviewed Simon, saw this good-looking boy skillfully completing a series of tasks such as restocking, inventory, stacking, and even cash register, he immediately felt that Simon had a bright future and readily hired him. However, in terms of salary, perhaps due to recognizing Simon as a Hollywood drifter who couldn't find too many jobs, Roger Griffin appeared very stingy and only willing to pay the basic $3.50 hourly wage. The only benefit of this job is that the salary is settled weekly, and Simon can earn $140 every week, which is just enough for him to pay for the basic living expenses. However, on the 3rd day of starting work, Simon had to face a somewhat tricky problem. When he checked into the hotel a week ago, he had less than $100 left in his pocket and had already paid a deposit of $50. Now, the first week of settling the rent has arrived, but the day for Griffin Supermarket to settle the salary has not yet arrived. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Encounter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Encounter. The kind-hearted Spanish elderly had already given Simon great convenience when he checked in, and if he left that hotel, it would be difficult for Simon to find a better place to stay in a short period of time. After considering it for a while, Simon approached Roger Griffin after handing over the shift in the afternoon to discuss whether he could pay a week's salary in advance. The supermarket owner, who has the potential to be picky, did not refuse at all, but said that everyone's salary in the store will only be settled once a week. Simon only worked 3 days this week, and if he wants to settle in advance, he will only be able to receive 3 days of salary this week. Simon had no intention of grinding his teeth for a few tens of dollars, and Roger Griffin, and readily agreed that 3 days of salary, including the remaining amount in his pocket, was already enough. As for another time difference next week, Simon also plans to find another temporary part-time job with more flexible settlement. Then, Simon's decision made the middle-aged fat man, who was not too bad at all, feel a bit embarrassed. With a strong conscience, he rounded him up and paid him $100. Leaving Griffin Supermarket, Simon walked for over 20 minutes back to his hotel. This is a typical, concave-shaped layout of a motel, with a white 2-story wooden building and a total of more than 10 rooms. There are also several cars parked in the yard. The sunshine in Los Angeles is just right in the afternoon. Entering the yard, Simon saw the hotel owner Diego Sacadu, who was in his spare time, sitting under the eaves playing and singing a guitar, enjoying himself. Simon used to think that the guitar was basically a young person's instrument. He played it for a while in college and never touched it again after work. But in the eyes of Westerners who see music as a part of life, it is obvious that there is no such conceptual constraint. He found a chair and sat down next to the Spanish old man. Simon listened quietly for a while. The old man is playing an old song by Elvis Presley called Blue Suede Shoes. If we don't consider the strong Spanish accent when humming, the elderly person's guitar level is still barely audible. Simon felt somewhat surprised when he made such an evaluation in his heart. His previous guitar skills were only limited to a simple flick of a hand like, "You sitting at the same table," which was definitely not as good as the Spanish elderly at this time. Although the old-fashioned melody of Blue Suede Shoes does not suit Simon's taste at all, it cannot be denied that the difficulty of playing this song is still significant. However, upon a moment's thought, Simon understood. In the other 12 memories, there is still a top Hollywood composer, and the guitar, as an entry-level instrument, is naturally easy to come by. Moreover, among other talented Hollywood elites, there are also guitar enthusiasts. The old man leisurely finished singing a song before turning to Simon and directly asked in Spanish, "Why are you back so early today?" Simon didn't answer, just smiled and took out his wallet. He handed the $100 bill to the old man and replied in Spanish, "Diego, this is my room money from last week. Also, thank you for taking care of me during this time." The old man nodded and took the money, but then glanced at Simon's wallet, teasing with concern and saying, "Without this $100, you're going to be hungry soon, right?" "That's not true," Simon shook his head and said with a smile. "I found a church nearby, so I should be able to get some food vouchers." The old man laughed heartily when he heard Simon's idea and said, "I like young people like you who can handle things with ease, but it's not very devout of you to do so. Oh, can you play guitar?" Simon was puzzled when he saw the old man hand over the guitar, but he still held it in his arms and almost instinctively readjusted the strings before starting to play the same song, "Blue Suede Shoes," which the old man had just played. As soon as the melody started playing, the innkeeper couldn't help but want to shake his head. This boy obviously knows a little guitar, but he's very awkward. However, seeing Simon's focused appearance, the old man did not interrupt. Then, the elderly Spanish witnessed a small miracle that left him somewhat stunned. In just 10 minutes, Simon's playing went from raw to proficient at a breathtaking speed. The elderly also belonged to the amateur level in guitar, so it is difficult for him to specifically describe Simon's guitar skills. However, the old man deeply realized that if Simon's playing level was still one street behind him 10 minutes ago. So, just 10 minutes later, this young man's guitar skills had already surpassed his own 10 streets, and he even had some room to play. When Simon stopped playing, the Spanish old man immediately asked, "Child, have you learned guitar before?" Simon nodded, equally surprised by his recent performance, and could only vaguely explain to the old man, "I haven't touched it in many years." The Spanish elderly clearly couldn't understand what Simon's concept of "many years" was, but they finally found a reason for their surprise. Since that's the case, the Spanish old man picked up his guitar and put it in a nearby box, but handed it back to Simon. "Give me your backpack and take this to the beach. It's currently the peak season for tourism, and I want to play there for a few hours at your level. The next few days' meal will be enough." Simon was just stunned for a moment, then readily handed over his backpack, which he had been inseparable from for the past few days, took the piano box and carried it on his shoulder. He even smiled at the old man with some confidence and said, "Diego, Gibson has lent me his guitar, so let me use his car. It's getting dark from here to the beach." "You little one," the old man shook his head and handed Simon the key, but deliberately said in a very vulgar tone, "Don't forget to cheer." Los Angeles, with its long coastline, has many famous beaches, and undoubtedly the most lively one is Venice Beach, adjacent to Santa Monica Beach. The beaches of Venice in summer appear even more lively. In addition to countless tourists from around the world, the pedestrian streets of Venice Beach also gather a variety of street performers, artists, painters, cyclists, roller skaters, and other groups, making the entire beach like a lively carnival. Simon arrived at Venice Beach after driving for more than 10 minutes. He spent $2 in the paid parking lot to save his car and then carried his guitar onto the famous pedestrian street on the beach. After a moment, Simon stopped at a pedestrian intersection on the street where the flow of people was relatively good. Putting the piano box at his feet and holding the guitar to reconfirm the feel, Simon casually selected Elton John's "Rocket Man" from his memory and began playing it. Under the sedimentation of 2 generations of human emotions, Simon did not feel any embarrassment about selling songs on the street. He even felt that it would be even more embarrassing for a big man to not be able to support himself. The sudden surge of superb guitar skills has unconsciously caught the attention of passers-by. Although Simon, who is accustomed to being focused, rarely interacts with people around him, there are always groups of tourists gathered around, listening to nursery rhymes for a while, putting down some change, and then leaving. The sunset unconsciously began to fall towards the sea level, and the orange light projected from behind Simon, dragging his shadow longer and longer. From 4 o'clock until now, almost 3 hours have passed, and Simon doesn't feel too tired either. Glancing at the piano box with a thick layer of coins under his feet, Simon felt that perhaps he didn't need to find a second part-time job, so he could use his time for other things. With this thought in mind, I was about to finish singing the last song and then finish work when a hand reached out from the side above the piano box. A beautiful hand, thin, slender, painted with fire-red nail polish. Obviously, it's a woman's hand. These thoughts flashed through Simon's mind, but his lowered gaze revealed that the beautiful woman's hand seemed to have no intention of putting money into the piano box, instead reaching out to the only $10 bill among them. This is too much. So Simon lifted his right foot and lightly stepped on the hand that wanted to do evil. The owner of the hand did not seem to have anticipated Simon's movements, and Simon did not anticipate that the hand would not dodge. So, it wasn't until Simon's right foot landed that a somewhat exaggerated female voice came from beside him. "Ah, little boy, how could you step on someone? It's so despicable." Simon helplessly held down the strings, withdrew his feet, and turned his head to look to the side. Janet Johnston, squatting next to the piano box, was staring at her sternly with an accusing expression on her face, without any sense of being caught as a thief. Catherine Bigelow stood next to her friend, with a helpless expression and an apologetic smile at Simon. Simon ignored the crazy woman still squatting on the ground and looked happily at Catherine. After meeting with Jonathan Friedman last week, he called Catherine once, but unfortunately no one answered and could only choose to leave a message. I didn't expect to encounter it unexpectedly at this moment. Catherine still wore a simple shirt and pants today, appearing very capable. Simon looked up and down at the woman and said, "What a coincidence, Catherine. How could you be here?" Although the boy's gaze in front of her was not aggressive, Catherine still felt a bit unnatural. She slightly dodged Simon's gaze and whispered, "Jenny's studio is here. I'm attending a production meeting in Beverly this afternoon. Come and go back to Malibu with Jenny." Simon nodded and said, "So, is it Blood Corpse night? How are you preparing?" "The casting process is coming to an end soon, but there are some funding issues with the production company and filming may be delayed by a few months," Catherine said, adding, "I saw your message. Also, Mr. Friedman has called me and he is very optimistic about you, just surprised by your age." Simon smiled, glanced at his watch, and then said to Catherine, "I haven't thanked you for this yet. Since we've encountered each other, can we treat you to a meal?" Having been ignored by Simon all along, Janet had an inexplicable little hatred in her heart. At this moment, when she heard him say this, the woman immediately pointed to the change in Simon's piano box and joked, "Little boy, you won't use this money to treat us to dinner, will you?" End of this chapter. Chapter 9. The Strange Events at Venice Beach. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. The Strange Events at Venice Beach. Simon finally looked at Janet Johnston with a slight smile and said seriously, "Actually, I just want to invite Catherine alone, but it's okay if you come along." Upon hearing this, Janet immediately embraced Catherine towards her, as if afraid that Simon would snatch the woman away. However, in an instant, she reacted again and extended a slender index finger to continue gesturing the piano box under her feet, saying, "What I mean is, you can't even open a better bottle of red wine with all your money." Simon casually plucked the strings and said, "I won't drink the red wine this time. As a boy, I'll treat 2 women to dinner and also serve red wine. I'll be misunderstood." Janet glanced at Simon's clothes and said contemptuously, "Who would have misunderstood you?" Simon also glanced at Janet's Hermes shoulder bag and smiled, "Yes, so I'm afraid you two might get misunderstood." Janet blinked her eyes a few times in a daze before realizing it. She glared at Simon fiercely and said, "Ah bah. Just stumbled upon Simon on the street, and Catherine wanted to walk silently. Last time we met, Simon left a deep impression on her. The woman instinctively felt that a boy as outstanding as him was naturally proud, and perhaps did not want to see his embarrassed appearance at this moment. Catherine had to meet Simon only when her friend forced her to approach. At this moment, listening to Jenny using words to squeeze Simon, Catherine intended to speak up and stop him, but noticed Simon's indifferent faint smile on his face, and the woman suddenly felt a little more clear in her heart. He was naturally proud, and from the many details of the first meeting, she could confirm this. However, this kind of pride clearly does not come with any kind of paranoia stemming from deep feelings of inferiority. Therefore, he did not feel how embarrassed his current state was. Faced with Jenny's run, he acted more like a mature and steady adult accommodating a stubborn little girl. Most of the time, aren't you also accommodating Jenny's little girl-like temperament? Thinking this way, Catherine couldn't help but laugh out loud as she saw her friend not getting any advantage in the verbal confrontation with Simon. "Where are you from?" Upon hearing Catherine's soft laughter, Janet immediately glared at her with displeasure, warned her, and then turned to Simon again. Her eyes turned, and the woman suddenly changed her face like a fairy, without any anger. She slowly took out her wallet from her shoulder bag, shook a $100 bill in front of Simon, and casually placed it in the piano box, saying, "Oh, little boy, I haven't heard enough just now. Sing another song. But if I'm not satisfied, I'll get the money back." Simon nodded and said, "Okay, I'll just open a bottle of red wine for you later." "Hey, didn't you hear that? I mean..." Janet was about to make another statement when the boy in front of her started plucking the strings. The expensive Gibson wooden guitar with a clear tone this time emitted a short, ding-ding-ding note. She felt a bit familiar, but for a moment, she didn't remember where she had heard it before. She instinctively said, "Well, I know, it's..." Simon repeatedly plucked the strings a few times, familiarized himself with the feel, looked up at the two women in front of him, with a faint smile on his lips, and said, "Here's Jenny, while be dance. As the words fell, the agile and rapid music had already jumped off the strings in front of Simon. The rapid melody that begins with a series of rapidly descending scales immediately creates a scene of a flexible wasp bending down towards the evil weaver and cook in the story. Immediately, the melody begins to roll up and down, just like the wasp swiftly flickering and moving. As the most famous soundtrack in the Russian composer Kosakov's opera, The Story of the Satan King, Wild Bee Dance, has appeared in many film and television works such as Green Bee Man, Shining Style, Secret That Cannot Be Saw Yet, and has gradually become a dazzling masterpiece for many musicians to showcase their musical skills with its extremely fast melody. Compared to guitarists who blindly strive for speed, causing a lot of mistakes and even playing Wild Bee Dance like a nest that explodes wasps, Simon values the completeness of the piece more and therefore does not deliberately pursue speed. However, with the help of Simon's hand speed of around 170 beats per minute, the standard 16th note melody suddenly flowed out at a high speed, still forming a wonderful freeze-frame image around the street in an instant. The pedestrians within the range covered by the sound of the chime were almost momentarily stunned, and then everyone focused their attention on a focused big boy. The mother, pushing the stroller, stopped in her tracks. The couple who were selecting handicrafts put down their nesting dolls, the boy who wanted to quickly pass through the crowd stepped on the skateboard under his feet, the middle-aged man on the bench on the street moved away from the newspaper in front of him, a crazy woman who wanted to continue nitpicking also widened her eyes and tightly pursed her mouth. At this moment, the big boy in front of me seemed to be the center of this universe. The melody played for more than 10 seconds, and a fashionable young girl who was already standing in front of Simon's stall seemed to wake up from a dream. She panicked and focused her Ultra 8mm camera on a certain boy. In fact, she had already passed by this boy half an hour ago, listening to him sing Johnny Mitchell's Big Yellow Taxi with a very unique arrangement, and then remembered her youthful and rebellious teenage years. On the new year when I just entered 9th grade, I was under strict pressure from my parents to rehearse Johnny Mitchell's song with my friends in the basement of my friend's house in preparation for the school's Christmas party. He built a road to heaven. Asterisk build a parking lot. Asterisk there are also boutique shops and pink hotels. Asterisk and various amusement parks. Asterisk Johnny Mitchell is truly a poet, admired by people. So many years have passed. Suddenly looking back. It feels like a distant world. She enjoys music, painting, and movies, and dreams of becoming an artist like Johnny Mitchell. However, she eventually followed her parents' wishes to enter Yale Law School. In the blink of an eye, it was already my final year of pursuing a law PhD. Accidental travel, unintentional street side, hearing the same song again, many thoughts from my teenage years suddenly surge into my heart. So, after wandering around the Venetian beach for a while, he unconsciously turned back and pretended to be a passerby, wanting to hear the boy sing, "Big Yellow Taxi," again. He even took out the camera from his bag to secretly record a video of him singing. Then I heard his conversation with those two women just now. And the stunning, wild bee dance at this moment. Her name is also Jenny. Standing beside, listening to the boy say, "Wild bee dance," for Jenny, the string in his heart was even plucked. Many people gathered on the street, and she no longer held back. She quietly walked over and hid herself in the crowd, adjusting the camera lens in her hand to focus on the figure in front of her who was playing the strings. At the same time, she felt a small shock in her heart at the profound guitar skills of this poorly dressed boy. She has studied piano, and the top pianist her parents specially invited to teach her happened to have demonstrated this piece to her and explained many details to her. Therefore, she knew that playing "Wild Bee Dance" was not too difficult, but playing it well was not easy. Moreover, compared to the piano, it is even more difficult to perfectly express this piece with a guitar that only has a few strings. But at this moment, the boy in front of him not only achieved this, but even created a strong visual sensation of a wasp dancing in the crowd through a perfect performance in the small world surrounded by the sound of the chime. Later, what surprised her even more was that after completing the first round of performance for about 70 seconds, the boy did not pause at all and immediately began the second round, with a noticeably faster rhythm, but the melody did not deviate at all. This should exceed 200 beats per minute, right? She thought to herself that 1 minute would pass quickly. Loop again, the melody accelerates once again. And then again. On the fifth attempt, she felt that even if the boy's hand speed did not reach 300 beats per minute, it was probably almost the same. The 16th note, "Wild Bee Dance," with 4 notes per beat and a hand speed close to 300 beats, is already a level that only the top guitarists can achieve. At this moment, he suddenly appeared on an ordinary street boy. Is this your own illusion? Or is it the Venice Beach supernatural event? Although it felt a bit unbelievable, she instinctively felt that the boy could definitely be faster. However, when the final performance was over, the piano suddenly came to an end. She shifted her gaze from the boy's profile and noticed that his palm was carefully pressed against the strings, clearly not intending to continue. A series of slightly regretful sighs seemed to float in the air. Immediately, all the pedestrians around the street applauded enthusiastically. She also wanted to applaud, but found herself still holding a camera in her hand. So he quickly turned it off, put it down without a trace, and gave him a guilty glance. Although I couldn't record the big yellow taxi I wanted, this video is definitely enough for me to cherish. Amidst the applause of the crowd, the boy politely thanked everyone, while others generously placed several large bills into the boy's piano box. She glanced and saw that the $100 that the woman had just put in was still eye-catching. However, the $10 bill he had put down half an hour ago, while he was not paying attention, had already been covered by other banknotes. Inexplicably regretful, although there was still a lot of cash in her wallet, she instinctively dared not step forward again. I'm afraid he'll notice me. She is such an inconspicuous girl. With this thought in mind, it was lively for a moment, but the onlookers still dispersed one after another. Realizing that I should also turn around and leave, but there are still a few people left, it seems okay to stay a little longer. Then I heard the woman who was very impolite to him just now ask him in a slightly stuttering tone, "Well, little boy, last time you said. Which psychiatric hospital did you come from?" End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Changes in the script. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Changes in the script. Simon didn't feel the girl silently staring at him in the crowd around him. When he heard Janet's words, he just smiled and said, "Why, are you planning to stay in there for a while?" Janet nodded sincerely and said, "Yes, if I could become like you, I could stay for a few years." Catherine also regained her senses at this moment, and in addition to being surprised, she once again developed a strong curiosity about Simon's past in her heart. However, upon hearing Janet's words, Catherine gave her friend a warning glare and said, "Jenny, don't joke about this kind of thing again." Janet felt Catherine's rare seriousness in her words, and immediately shrank her neck, pleasantly holding onto her arm and shaking it, and as expected, she stopped speaking. Simon calmed down his slightly rapid heartbeat after being fully focused on playing, noticed Janet's small movements, smiled, and handed the guitar in his arms to Catherine in front of him, saying, "Can you help me hold it?" Catherine reached out and took it, still feeling a bit puzzled. Simon had already squatted down and started sorting the coins in the piano box in front of him. Feeling the guitar in her hand as she wanted to step forward and help, Catherine had to stand and carefully hold the guitar in her arms. Janet looked at the guitar in front of her, reached out and was opened by Catherine. She pouted discontentedly and even squatted down to help Simon organize the coins. She even picked up a 5-cent coin and criticized someone for being too stingy. Quickly sorting out all the coins in the piano box, even without Janet's just $100 bill, there were still over $260, far exceeding Simon's expectations. Let Janet hold a small pile of coins. Simon stuffed the notes into his jeans pocket, took the guitar from Catherine's hand, carefully packed it in the box, carried it on his shoulder, and looked at the woman, saying, "So, why don't we go have dinner?" "Okay," Catherine didn't hesitate this time, nodded with a smile, and suggested proactively, "There's a good Mexican restaurant nearby. Shouldn't it be a problem to walk over there?" "Of course, it's just north." "Oh, how do you guys go back later?" "My car is in the parking lot over there. Coincidentally, mine is also over there, just borrowing the hotel owner's car." "It's a great person." "Is the guitar also borrowed?" "Yeah." Janet stood still, staring blankly at the man and woman who were about to walk away side by side, and then lowered her head to look at the coin she was still holding in her hand. What was going on? Are you just being forgotten like this? Thinking of this, Janet suddenly became angry and shouted in a hoarse voice on the street, "Simon Westeros, if you dare to take another step, I'll throw away this pile of things." Many people on the pedestrian street were once again drawn to their attention. Simon and Catherine also turned around and looked at Janet, who was panting with anger. Simon quickly returned and said, "Sorry, Jenny, I'll come get it." Janet slammed all the coins into Simon's hand and gave Catherine an aggrieved glare. Both of them felt a bit embarrassed. Catherine stepped forward and grabbed Janet, while Simon put the coins in place before the three of them walked north again. Looking at Janet, who was intentionally separated between the two, Simon had no choice but to speak and said, "So, Catherine, you just said Jenny's studio is here." "What studio?" "Art studio," Catherine replied. "Jenny is a painter. If you have money in the future, you can buy her paintings." "Oh, definitely. I won't sell it to you, little bastard. I'm offering a high price. Not for sale. Double." "Ah bah. Hee hee," Catherine chuckled lightly as she saw her friend staring at her. She quickly said to Simon, "Jenny is also very impressive. She actually graduated from Columbia University Business School, and Buffett has also attended Columbia University Business School." "Simon, Buffett, do you know?" Simon nodded and said, "Of course." Catherine continued, "That year, when Buffett gave a speech at Columbia University, Jenny argued with Buffett in the auditorium. If it weren't for the dean of the business school trying to smooth things out, Jenny would have almost caused the other party to step down. It's really impressive, Simon smiled and continued, why did you switch to being a painter again? Catherine only glanced at her best friend this time and smiled without explaining. Janet glanced at Simon curiously and simply glanced at her. As they chatted casually, the three of them arrived at a nearby Mexican restaurant. Although Simon had a few $100s in his pocket, both women only ordered a $25 set meal. However, Simon complied with Jenny's wishes and ordered a decent bottle of red wine with her $100. After dinner, Simon left Catherine with the contact information of the motel before parting ways with the two women. After paying the dinner bill, Simon still had over $100 left in his hand, enough to support the salary payment for next week's supermarket work, so he gave up the idea of wasting time on part-time jobs. Having solved his financial troubles, Simon can be considered completely settled in Los Angeles. Once a day appears unchanging, it often passes by quickly. In the blink of an eye, it was already Simon's third week in Los Angeles, entering July. In his spare time, Simon basically maintains a frequency of 2 phone calls with Jonathan Friedman per week. The agent did not conceal his intention to turn Butterfly Effect into a bundled project from him. Last Wednesday, Simon rushed to WMA headquarters at the invitation of Jonathan Friedman and chatted for over half an hour with the film director Brian De Palma, whom his agent was interested in. Brian De Palma became famous in the 1970s for The Witch Carrie, but Simon knew that he was also the director of Tom's first Mission Impossible, 10 years later, making him one of the most famous evergreen directors in Hollywood. Therefore, although Brian De Palma's takeover of The Butterfly Effect may to some extent overshadow the brilliance of the script itself, Simon is also pleased to see the involvement of this well-known director in promoting the entire project. Everything originally seemed very smooth. However, a few days ago I had a phone call with my agent, but the other person told him that something had changed. Friedman's initial idea was to use all the artists in his hands, but after the script for Butterfly Effect spread within the company, other senior executives at WMA also had ideas for this project. The agent didn't explain too clearly this time. Simon couldn't figure out the joints, but he also understood that he must continue to patiently wait for a while. As a newcomer who has just debuted, he naturally cannot have much influence on the internal game of WMA, and can only obediently play a chess piece at this time. On the other hand, after overcoming the tight budget in the first week, Simon only retained his job at Griffin's Supermarket and began his other plans. It's another ordinary Thursday afternoon, but tomorrow is July 4th, National Day in the United States, followed by the entire weekend. Therefore, many people have already fallen into the holiday atmosphere in advance, and the passenger flow in supermarkets has significantly increased. So, how was today? Standing behind the cashier, Simon saw Courtney Cox coming over with a bunch of snacks, helping the girl check out while casually greeting. Working at Griffin's Supermarket for less than a week, Simon discovered that Courtney Cox happened to live nearby and often shopped there. Courtney also found this matter very interesting. Every time she came to buy something, she would specially chat with Simon, and the two of them would unconsciously get to know each other. However, Courtney's mood today is clearly very bad. Upon hearing Simon's greeting, Courtney, whose expression was already somewhat gloomy, couldn't help but say, "I just received a notification of failed auditions. What do you think will happen?" Simon smiled and said, "There's no need to be so discouraged. With such good conditions, you'll definitely have more opportunities. Speaking of which, I'm currently preparing an experimental movie, why don't you take on the lead role?" Experimental movie. Courtney glanced at Simon's supermarket clerk outfit and joked, "Let's not say if you know how to make movies. First of all, do you have money?" "When Joe sells my script, I'll probably have money," Simon said, packing Courtney's snacks and saying, "That's a total of $19.75. Courtney handed over two $10 bills, still speaking sarcastically, you've been here for a few weeks without any action. By the time Joe sells your script, maybe I'm already a big star like Michelle Pfeiffer. You can't even afford the small change in my pay for a single script. Simon gave Courtney change and said, Michelle Pfeiffer shouldn't be expensive, right? However, a woman who does have a lot of taste may have the opportunity to date her in the future. Courtney weighed the coins in her hand and gave Simon a white glance, saying, it's really rare. You're daydreaming and haven't changed the money wrong. With such a merciless blow to Simon, Courtney's mood noticeably improved. Before leaving, she said goodbye with great face, then picked up her shopping bag and turned around to leave. Simon threw the small ticket that Courtney had pulled down into the nearby trash can. Seeing that there were no customers behind him, he was about to sit down and rest for a while. Supermarket owner Roger Griffin, who liked to wander around the store to show his presence, rubbed his chubby body over and leaned over the cashier, saying, Hey kid, using the excuse of making a movie to pick up girls is really bad. If I had just asked her out earlier, I've been worried about you all these days. Simon didn't take the conversation from this middle-aged fat man who was definitely full of thieves and didn't have the courage to do so. Instead, he said, I'm not making any excuses. Speaking of which, Roger, can I take some shots in your store then? Sure, Roger Griffin remained cheerful and straightforward, as long as you pay. Of course I won't use it in vain, Simon laughed. However, let me clarify one thing first. This is a robbery scene. Roger didn't look like Simon was joking at all. He squinted his eyes and looked at him before quickly saying, okay, but during filming, you need to replace the storefront with a temporary new sign, and there shouldn't be too specific address information in the camera. The movie in my memory took several weeks to persuade a supermarket to cooperate in filming a robbery scene. Simon didn't expect his turn to go smoothly, so he immediately nodded and raised his hand to Roger, saying, that's settled. Although he, like Courtney, was very pessimistic about Simon's idea of making a movie, the middle-aged chubby man shook his hand and said, Kid, if you're going to make a movie someday, remember to leave me a role. Simon didn't think either, so he simply said, of course not a problem. After chatting with Simon for a few words, Roger walked away leisurely. Simon continued to work for half an hour, and when it was time to change shifts and hand over to the next employee, he left with his light gray canvas backpack on his back. End of this chapter.